Argumentative Indians. I am Abhirami Boina, and with us we have a very special guest, Aparna Joshi. Aparna is a second year undergraduate student at Delhi University. She's a history major. She's the author of 5 books spanning topics of history and international conflict, titles including India and Her Neighbors, The International Criminal Court Comes of Age at 18, Reimagining Sources of History, Wit and Humor based on anecdotal evidence, and her current book, Indian Mughal Miniatures in the Global Art Scene from 1526 to 1770. It was printed and distributed by the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage for non-commercial and academic purposes. She has also authored 42 articles and research papers previously, especially on international organizations and their functioning. She is also a member of the CTBTO Youth Group and American Historical Association, Academia, and ResearchGate. It's an honor to have you here, Aparna. All right, so the title of this session is Does Art Have a Nationality? And to introduce the topic, art is generally a universally appreciated form of expression that in many cases predates formal political organization. The earliest examples of art can be found in the form of cave paintings at Bhimbetka and Altamira and other cave shelters as well. However, it has always been used as a tool of political patronage and legitimization. For example, in ancient India, Buddhist paintings were patronized by the Mauryan and Gupta dynasties to show their names attached to claim legitimacy from Buddhist sources. Later in Mughal times, the usage of motifs such as the lion and the lamb, and in modern times, poster art, all aim to depict the emperor or the politician as a supreme being who needs to be trusted and respected. This begs the question of the importance of patronization, art appreciation, and conservation. What deserves to get preserved or patronized by the ruling elites? Further, institutional patronization leads to a religious or communal identity around painting or art. An example can be seen in the Mughal painting styles of chronicling in the medieval period. With the recent school curriculum trying to shun the concepts of Islamic record keeping and historicity, is India at the cusp of losing yet another tradition that New India now sees as alien? How does art deal with the context of external influences? And therefore, can it have these multiple polarizing identities? For example, only devotional and temple art gets to be patronized. However, the deserted remains of the Yogini temples in central Western India tell a different tale altogether. Buddhist, Jain, and temple paintings seem to influence each other and draw from the Greek style of art and proportion. Is that too to be treated as yavna or outsider? With the rise of nation states and rigid boundaries, therefore, does art have a nationality? Art as a whole has been used as it's been used as an arm of the state. Does it therefore have a distinct political identity as Hindu, secular, nationalist, or liberal? Lastly, is it the domain of political gains or a paradigm of social change? Without any further ado, Aparna, my first question is, do you think art has a nationality? And what is it that is considered as Indian art? So, yeah.
You've brought up a lot of interesting and also complex concepts for me to try and break down. We can say that art has an identity. It may be recognized as, let's say, Hindu art or like temple art, Islamic or Mughal art, Buddhist art. It may be identified, but it cannot have a nationality because art, along with culture, actually has traveled with traders, merchants, ruling classes from one place to another. So it cannot have an identity. It can have a distinct feature. It can have distinctive identifying features, but I don't think it can have a nationality. Let me attempt to break this down with an example. So if we look at the Greco-Roman and the Greco-Roman period, there was this concept of proportionality and beauty in the fact that there should be no physical imperfections on the human form. Right. Now, this idea was taken and then it was in a way translated into the Gandhar school of what we see in India, where we find that again, they attempted to the best of their capabilities to have a perfection in form. So though it was not, something that was patronized by the Greeks, it was not made by the Greeks. It was made on the Indian subcontinent with Indian materials like granite. So it did have an identity. So now when modern day historians and scholars look at it, we say that it has a Greco-Roman influence. It means that we have an influence of that perfection coming out into that art, but it cannot be called, it cannot be identified with a nationality as such.
Okay. Then the second part of my question is, what is Indian art, right? Like, what is it that is considered as Indian art? Maybe you could throw some light on that.
Well, Indian art is a broad and overarching term. It encompasses multiple forms of art, right? So Indian art could be painting, it could be sculpture, architecture, as also the performing arts, all of which are a melting pot of the different traditions that have influenced India in her long journey. Here I take up an example each. So if we look at painting, and if we were to look at the company school, right, or the early modern company school of painting, here if we see the form was influenced by the European understanding of how a painting must be made, and how especially if we looked at the European ruling classes, how their paintings were made to show power, legitimacy and strength. That is something similar to what was done in India, especially with the Nawabs of Awadh, right, where they actually brought up that kind of strength and power, showing themselves with a sword. Always, you know, surrounding themselves with symbols of the state, the sword in hand, chandeliers, grandeur in the background. That was influenced by the European style as well as the Mughal style of painting, where the ruler would be pedestalized. So if we saw a composition, typical Mughal composition would have the ruler at a slight pedestal as compared to the remainder of the composition, which is set slightly lower by the painter. This again is a more traditional Indian sense of things, where the Badshah or the emperor is seen as shadow of God on earth. And similar to the way that God is pedestalized, the painter attempted to pedestalize the emperor. So it is with both of these, it is the intermingling of these two elements that actually brings together and brings out what constituted early company painting, especially, and also with the physical features of the individuals. They looked more Indian than European. So there were distinct elements in their racial features, in the kind of colors that they wore, or the kind of colors that were used around them, which were brighter and bolder, very much similar to the Indian subcontinent, and not subdued, muted greens and blues, similar to the naturalist school that was prevalent in Europe at the time. Coming down to architecture, again, it's similar, because there are elements of borrowing, there are elements, especially with building material, construction materials, red sandstone used throughout history for some of the most imposing buildings, especially in material, and also in the style and how the jharokha, for example, is adopted. It was created by the Rajputs in the Rajwada region of the early medieval period. Then it traveled down to becoming really important in Akbar's architecture. And then it moved on to, the imperial architecture, and it was used extensively for decorative purposes. We can't really say that what part of Indian art as a whole is Indian. It is influenced, it is multicultural. So it's better that we call it subcontinental if we have to say anything about it. And treat it as such.
what I'm hearing is there is such a thing as Indian art. At the same time, there is not, because of how multicultural it is and how it's basically borrowed from multiple places. So, is it fair for me to say that Indian art is a thing, but at the same time, if you look at it, if you understand nuance, then it's probably not a thing either?
Well, Indian art is definitely a thing. Like, Indian art can have its defining characteristics, and I could go on and expound on how those defining characteristics are very much Indian. However, if we look at it from a broader perspective, those features of Indian art, those features are really not something that can be called distinctly Indian or distinctly European, Middle Eastern, and the
Right.
like.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Sort of picking up from the previous question, right? So we refer to certain art and architectural styles by their religious connotations, like Islamic architecture or Buddhist architecture or Hindu temple architecture. Isn't that almost like giving a religious identity to art?
Well, when we deal with architecture, for example, and we call it temple architecture, or we call it mosque or Islamic architecture, or we call it cathedral architecture, we are definitely giving it a religious color. We are definitely trying to narrow down our perspective and boxing it and associating it with those religious institutions. In saying that, I would like to also highlight the fact that these religious institutions are also cultural melting pots. They are also places of community interaction and centers where, in times of crisis, people actually gather and assist each other. So here again, if we take an example of a temple town or any major pilgrimage site across the world, it is most likely always on a trading network. It would be along the sea coast. Most of our pilgrimage sites are along the sea coast. That's also a place where traders, merchants, especially coming from abroad, would dock their ships and bring their wares into the port cities.
Okay.
These temple towns also were centers of trade and commerce. So looking at it as merely a place of pilgrimage would also color our vision slightly. And it was the place where artisans, often because they were employed in these areas, they would interact with their counterparts coming from other places and get influenced. And, it would not be very difficult to imagine this conversation occurring between maybe two artisans discussing, okay, how do we chisel stones? How do you chisel stones? This is how we do it in our culture. And taking that learning and implementing it in a museum or in a monument or any kind of building. So therefore, can we really say that, what parts and what elements are uniquely religious in nature? And those same elements can be picked up and used as part of forts, as part of other government buildings or governance buildings. Right now, the example of forts is the one coming to my mind. And there it's not religious anymore. For example, a raised plinth can be used for a ruler in his processional area, but a raised plinth is also used in a temple for the primary deity. Right. So that's an element of Hindu temple architecture, the raised plinth. So we can't really call these elements of architecture, especially, as quote-unquote religious, or trying to give it here stood a temple, this is temple architecture. Here stands a mosque, this is Islamic architecture. Yes, a mosque and a temple are obviously distinctive features and distinctive identifiers of religion, but coloring their style of architecture as religious does not seem to fit how we should be approaching especially when we are looking at the conservation aspect, because there it comes in, their identities play an important role. What gets conserved? How is it conserved? Who would take up the responsibility of the conservation? So, to my mind, that just doesn't fit how we should be celebrating architecture, especially in India.
All right, fair enough. In that context, to what extent do you think communal identities are ascribed to art and architecture? And does it have an effect on what we choose to preserve and glorify and what we choose to keep on the periphery?
Well, communal identities have an indirect impact on art itself. We can't say that a communal identity has a direct impact. Definitely not. There are instances of Hindus and Muslims working together on various projects, on trying to bring something to life, which is maybe the vision of their ruler. So communal identities, yes, they are ascribed very often. We would hear this statement of, this is Buddhist art, this is Islamic art, this is, let's say a Christian art. However, when in doing this, we are also alienating our own identity. A lot of people identify with that art as just a form of livelihood. Right? In fact, a lot of times when we are looking at the art form, we forget that it is a form of livelihood. And the artisans involved are making a living off that particular type of art. So if we say that only a particular community can present this art or can work in this field, we are invariably shrinking the playing field. We are invariably shrinking the development of that art. That art will, after a point, stultify, will, after a point, decline, because it stops having that broad base appeal. It stops having the kind of appeal that it would if it were just left as art, not getting the religious identities involved in here. So, yes, to some extent, and no to another extent. I mean, because when we're, a lot of times, it is in that identifying with the community that we are able to appeal to the sensibilities of people, to say that, look, this is an important part of your identity, your culture, and you need to preserve it. So yes, it is a motivating factor. It can work as a motivating factor. But to what extent are we promoting the appeal and promoting this view is what needs to actually be measured.
Right. I was thinking about was if we could make this thing slightly accessible by giving an example, right? The question I asked was, does it have an impact on what we choose to preserve and glorify and what we choose to keep on the periphery? Can you think of any contemporary examples that would reflect the same, where communal identities have been ascribed to some sort of art and architecture, and we have very consciously chosen to, and we cherry-picked basically and chose to glorify one, promote one, at the same time completely ignore the other, if not alienate it?
Well, okay. So there are multiple examples that we can come up with. But yeah, so when, let's say, an excavation takes place, and there have been multiple excavations, and there have been multiple claims of this, after which, there's this whole movement that begins for and opposed to a particular monument being built over the remains of another. Right, and suddenly the monument that is standing atop the older monument becomes less important as to finding out what was below, what was the structure below. Now, this has led to multiple controversies, especially here again, I do not particularly enjoy taking up these examples because they are highly political in nature. But
Mm-hmm.
in saying that, there have been controversies about Taj Mahal, there have been controversies about Qutub Minar, about multiple such, even for
Mm-hmm.
Somnath. In fact, even for Somnath, which is a temple over another temple because of multiple floods.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it was looted and plundered, and each and every time that there's loot and plunder, we ascribe a color and an identity to that very topic itself. Not realizing that at the time when that loot and plunder did take place, it was not merely for identity purpose, but it was also that it was an important source of income for those particular empires. In saying this, we do not in any way support the idea of looting, but
Yeah.
recognizing the fact that there was duality here, and it cannot be seen in isolation or seen as something that was trying to defame one identity to assert another.
No, you make a good point. The only reason I asked you to give the example is so that we can have a better picture in our head, yeah? Quite literally and metaphorically. All right. So moving on to the next question. Do you think, I mean, does giving a religious identity to any form of art bring into question its survival or promotion? Or is it a celebration of it as a tradition? You slightly answered this question in the previous one, but maybe if you could get into the details of it.
Definitely, having it as a religious identity would definitely show how it's promoted and how it's preserved, protected. For example, the tradition of Indian arts, of Indian dances, right? Indian dances are heavily influenced not only by temple traditions, but also the fact that they survived into the modern age because of the temple patronage, the temple and the coming in of the Devdasis and so on and so forth. Right. So when we are discussing, so yes, religious institutions do play a role. I do not discount that for a single second. However, when we choose to celebrate one religious identity over another, that's where survivability comes in, because then that form of art would merely be reduced into the temple, maybe into a mosque or into some other, for example, Qawwali. Here again, if we say that Qawwali is, of course, it's associated with Sufi dargahs, with Sufism, but if we ascribe it to be completely Muslim and not greater Indian at that perspective, that is the time that the Qawwal would struggle for his survival. Because a large part of why even dances, so I brought up dances before, both of them have now come out of their religious institutions, are popularly enjoyed by the Indian masses, and a large part of the financing of these two comes from shows, not from the patronization of the temple or the dargah. So survivability definitely plays a very important role, and how identities and how we choose to celebrate those identities really comes into play, especially in a country as multicultural as India.
All right. Yeah. Moving on to the next question from there. The CBSE has removed several chapters from the history and political science syllabi of class 11 and 12 recently. These are chapters like the rise of the Islamic empires and Afro-Asian territories, the chronicles of Mughal courts, among other things, among other chapters that were deleted. How do you think this affects the students and their almost preliminary engagement with Indian art and architectural identities? Because I'll be honest, when I was introduced to this in my CBSE 11 standard text, through my CBSE 11 standard history textbook, that was the first time I engaged with any sense of Indian art and architectural identities. Sure, I went and studied it in college later, but this played a very important role in gauging that interest, in me helping me recognize that I have an interest in this in the first place. But if these kind of chapters are removed, then where does it place the students, right? Because this is the first time almost any of them are engaging with it because of the textbook.
Well, commenting firstly on the deletion of these chapters, the addition and deletion of curriculum and syllabi is a regular process. It's done time to time, and it's a purely politically motivated exercise to reinforce and to celebrate identities, as I have been mentioning time and time again. Here it can be seen, of course, as an attempt at saffronization. However, talking about how cutting out a chapter, for example, like chronicling of the Mughal day, it talked extensively about painting. It talked extensively about the importance of painting and how painting played a primary role in actually preserving what we now know as our early modern history. And it also engages the students with the questions of how effective are these methods of chronicling? How effective is it to record our daily life? What is the importance of maintaining such a record? So, in my opinion, removing any kind of chapter regarding the preservation and conservation of history, the preservation and conservation of our day-to-day activities is detrimental to the overall benefit of a student, because irrespective of the fact that the child may after school level leave history as a discipline. However, that importance of chronicling and supporting and recording their daily life is something that would be useful irrespective of whether they are in history or in any of our aligned social science fields, because we must, when we start viewing ourselves as not merely individuals, but as someone who's aware of history and the fact that years and years from today, we may want to go back into our own lives, right? And that is what those chronicles, those Mughal chronicles were also for. They were not so much for future generations as they were for the emperor himself to build his glory and to show that, this was my grand empire, this was my dynasty, and this is what it was, a process of self-glorification. So that impact of that chronicling, here I'm not saying that an individual would glorify themselves, especially today when we record our daily events, but the importance of that and drawing. So here again, the miniatures were not merely just paintings, they were symbols of legitimization, they were something that power and prestige basically was were two of the main features that miniatures work towards. So when we look at paintings and we term them as part of the chronicle, we are actually cutting them away from their own individual importance. There have been historians in the past, and there are scholars who look at primarily just art and have reconstructed our history based on just the visual representations, just the aesthetics, rather than also working with the written record.
Right. You've mentioned what you think of this move, but I wanted to ask you, why do you think this was implemented in the first place? Like, was it even necessary to take off these chapters that are such an integral part of Indian history, or not? I'd like to know your views.
Well, by removing these chapters, firstly, we've done a great disservice to students of history, because this is these are concepts that will come back to them in various forms, right? For example, I'll take up the example of the Islamic empires chapter that they have removed now. Now, this is a chapter that will come, obviously, when you're higher studies in history and you're doing your Middle Eastern, Abbasid empire, that's one place where it will come back to you. And it's good to have had a basis in it, obviously, in the 11th standard. Another place that it would come back to you would be pol science, because when you're studying political science and the Middle Eastern, and you start doing your Middle Eastern conflict as part of IR, again, somewhere the aspect of how Islam actually developed, why is it such an integral part of the culture, because the culture and the politics of this area is completely developed based on this religious identity that formed. So by breaking down that portion of the syllabus, what we've actually done is we've isolated it and we've not allowed a holistic view. And this in turn would put the student at a disadvantage. Not all students in India today prefer to study within India.
Right.
Right? There are many who go out on scholarship where these things, they go abroad, they're competing with people who know these things. And generally Indians have, as a national identity, been known for their intellect, for how we analyze things, for how our understanding is at a higher level. And that to a large part is attributed to the fact that we've had that exposure in our schools through our curriculums, right? Even if that the time for that exposure may be limited to that class, it may be limited to that textbook, but having the holistic impact. And also when we are studying world history, the world beyond
Aparna?
Yeah. The world goes beyond, let's say, an India or Europe. It goes beyond India and Europe, and there are other countries. There is the entire African continent, which again, 20 years.
Aparna, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you, see you.
Yeah. So when you're going...
I can't anymore though.
But my net connection's fine.
Oh yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. Please go on.
Okay. Yeah. So when you're, breaking down the African... Again, they've done this. They've removed the African history portion of the curriculum. So again, we're probably moving backwards in terms of history rather than moving forward and bringing in the newer scholarship, right? We're probably moving away from the fact that historians have worked so hard and so long to inculcate the divergence and say that there was a history beyond Europe and beyond, our regional South Asia, West Asia, and see it all as a global net. So I think we're moving backwards in that sense rather than moving forward, which in the long run, I would say even in the next 5 years, maybe a decade, would start showing its impact.
Okay, fair enough. Seeing that we have a little more time, I thought I have a personal question to ask you. I am particularly interested in the art of Raja Ravi Verma, and again, this is slightly moving away from discussing art of the Mughal period and things like that. Do you know how he used a European style, right? His paintings were European style, but he portrayed Indian subjects, and he was also, I wouldn't say he was called a national hero, but then I think later on he was considered a national hero in terms of nationalizing art in one way or another. I think the most famous phrase is that gods came home because of him, because of things like poster art, because of things like matchbox art, because of things like how art became a thing that a common man could access, right? And do you think to that particular art, to the art of Raja Ravi Verma, we can ascribe the identity of Indian art or call it? I am under the understanding that that art does have a nationality, because this man sort of went and presented his pieces abroad, and that gave India an identity in terms of, like, for instance, look at Shakuntala by Raja Ravi Verma, right? That is an immensely beautiful painting. It's known worldwide. People have posters of it at home right now and all of that. That is considered as Indian art to the world, right? So do you think maybe art does have a nationality in the context of, in a very specific context, in the Raja Ravi Verma context, I mean?
Okay, so coming to this question, I feel that it's way deeper than Raja Ravi Verma and his style of art. Raja Ravi Verma definitely popularized Indian art. He definitely popularized the fact that art has certain distinct features. Those distinct features that I was talking about, Raja Ravi Verma really celebrated those features. He celebrated the Indian. He was definitely an academic artist. He was definitely taught by the best European minds. But his art did not come up in isolation. This was a time in Indian history where art began to take up a political mantle. It was the time of the Bengal school. It was the time when India began to be seen as a mother. It was the time also of, let's say, an Rabindranath Tagore, Gagendranath Tagore, along with an Amrita Shergill, who all came together and actually began to celebrate the Indianness of art. So yes, in the nationalist phase, in the Swadeshi phase, obviously, Indian art began to be celebrated. The Indian elements of art. Here again, I'll take the example of Rabindranath Tagore's Bharat Mata. A very common example, very commonly similar to Shakuntala, very commonly depicted, portrayed. A young girl dressed in a orange or a saffron sari, right? Implements of knowledge, food, clothing and shelter in her hands, and vermilion. Vermilion, again, something very distinctly Indian. Right, so that is where the national identity, but again, why was this made? This was made in the context of the Swadeshi movement of Bengal. So we cannot divorce the Bengal school and the Bengal school identity from the political narratives and the political struggles that began to be seen in this phase of Indian history. So when we see a Raja Ravi Verma and we claim that his art is Indian art and his art actually took Indian art abroad, right? There again, I would tend to differ with you because Indian art went abroad even before Raja Ravi Verma. It was taken, it was looted and plundered, but it was taken and it was kept and housed in these opulent palaces of the British who returned from India. They were called Nawabs, a distorted term for the term Nawab. Again, so they were seen as social climbers. They were not treated with a lot of respect once they returned because they were seen as people who went to fame and fortune, got it easily and came back. So they were not seen as people with the class and the grace of the landed aristocracy, but of course they could not be discounted given the fact that they had so much wealth. And they housed these exhibits in these huge halls, called their Oriental display. The Orient and the Occident, right? Taking that narrative of India as the Orient and the West as the Occident, and how India was highly romanticized. India as a country was highly romanticized. If people wished for something and they wished to become someone and they really didn't have the means for it, they were encouraged to become factors. They were encouraged to go out exploring. And that is how colonialism and the story of colonization actually takes place. The mercantilism is one part of it, but another part is this quest of exploration and this quest for treasures. Claiming that pieces of art were treasure. Again, giving Indian art a value and treasuring it. So in fact, today, even today, to this day, the largest collections of Indian treasures or Indian artifacts are not found in India, but are found in Europe.
Right, right.
So Raja Ravi Varma, yes, he made it more accessible, because by then the printing press and the use of the printing press to popularize his art.
Right.
But it cannot be seen as something that was a landmark moment as such in bringing India out and taking it to Europe, because the idea of India had already reached Europe by the time that we see Raja Ravi Varma actually coming to the fore.
Right, fair enough. All right, we're sort of coming towards the end of the session. So in the context of that, do you have any concluding thoughts about this topic that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, in conclusion, there are a couple of things. Definitely, this question itself is open-ended. I would love to hear questions and love to see questions regarding some of the aspects that we've merely scratched the surface of. And in the context of art having a nationality and preservation, conservation, it's something that we can see collectively. And it would be my urge to everyone, since we are, looking at this from an informed perspective, that the conservation of Indian art is something that has been neglected in the past. It continues to be relatively neglected. So if we take the responsibility of preserving the art form as a form, and knowing a little bit about maybe exhibits in our own homes, that is where the change will come in. The change is not a massive change. It's not something that can be done at a large scale. Right. So if we were to know a little bit about the art, let's say, that hangs on our walls in our homes, irrespective. It could be a contemporary artist, it could be an older painting, right? But if we just know that, okay, this was painted for this purpose and this is how it reached our home, right, that is where we'll be able to actually move away from the whole idea of nationality and come into our own identities and find out that this art that I've been seeing on my wall for maybe so many years has an identity, and that is where the conservation comes into each individual, and then we'll stop asking questions like these. We will stop ascribing those tags of communal identities to art if we just start appreciating it as the broader perspective and not merely as identified within these strictures of a certain style.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Aparna. That was a very insightful session. I personally feel very enlightened at the moment after the session. I would also like to thank all our audience for joining us. Thank you so much. And for more such interesting and insightful sessions, do follow our Instagram page and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Argumentative India. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.